Hello and welcome to the Ιακя Wakpadaŋ Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other Indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Ιακя Wakpadaŋ watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Kasey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Crystal Boyd. I'm a project manager with the Ιακя Wakpadaŋ Bassett Creek Oral History Project. And we're here today with Dr. Kasey Keeler, who interviewed 14 people who live, work, or play in areas surrounding the creek. And Kasey, thank you for joining us to share more about the project.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me, Crystal.
Thank you. And to get started, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe describe your connections to the Ιακя Wakpadaŋ area?
Sure. As you mentioned, my name is Kasey Keeler. I'm an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne Band of Miwok Indians, which is in California. Geographically, it's easy to point to it on the map, just outside of Yosemite National Park. I'm also a direct descendant of the citizen Potawatomi, who are present day located in Oklahoma, but were removed from areas of southern Michigan and northern Indiana. Right now, I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, and I hold a joint appointment in the American Indian Studies program in the Department of Civil Society and Community Studies. And I grew up in the Twin Cities. I consider myself a suburban Indian. So that is kind of how I came to join this project, was my lived experience growing up in the Twin Cities. And my research, which really focuses on American Indians in the Twin Cities and thinking about suburbs as historically Indian places.
Yes, absolutely. So you have some connections to the West Metro, which is where Valley Community Presbyterian Church is located. And through their land acknowledgement process, they wanted to do an oral history project. And that's where you came into this work. How did you get connected?
Right. So I finished my PhD at the University of Minnesota in the American Studies program. And when you finish your PhD and you write your dissertation, they become available online. So about 2 years ago now, in August of 2021, Crystal reached out to me about this project, and we were able to have a really nice phone call talking about this project and what it might look like and potential involvement. And Crystal welcomed me to apply for the oral historian to conduct the interviews. So as Crystal mentioned, I do have connections to the West Metro. I did grow up in Coon Rapids, so not on the Bassett Creek watershed, but on the Mississippi River watershed, just a few miles north of the Bassett Creek area. But more recently, I also lived in Crystal, Minnesota, while I was a graduate student at Minnesota. So just north of Golden Valley, but still within that Bassett Creek watershed. So Crystal and I connected on the phone in August 2021, and I did apply for the oral historian position for this project, and everything went along smoothly, and I was selected to be the oral historian. So I came to join this project, and I was really excited to join it because of my experience, my research interests, and just my commitment to the community, to the West Metro, to suburban Indian people, to the Twin Cities. So that is how I came to join the Bassett Creek Ιακя Wakpadaŋ Oral History Project.
And it's been fantastic. It's been so great to work with you. I really loved the perspectives that you brought to the project, and you helped expand the project. We had an original grant to do 8 interviews, and then you helped expand that, right?
Right. So the good folks at Valley Community Presbyterian Church, their land acknowledgement task force, including Crystal, took the lead on applying for and securing a grant from the Minnesota Historical Society. It was the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and that began in January 2022. And we used that grant to leverage an additional grant from the University of Wisconsin through their Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, which I'm affiliated with as a faculty member. So the grant from the Minnesota Historical Society allowed us to originally conduct 8 interviews, but we were able to expand the project and complete a total of 14 interviews with the additional funding from the University of Wisconsin, including conducting some community-wide events at the church during the summer of 2022. And we've also been able to do some continued outreach as well.
I love it. I'm so glad you mentioned that. We did a big community celebration that was open to the public. We added a peace poll with some Dakota and Anishinaabe languages. We had a Dakota storyteller come and talk. So it was an oral history project, but with lots of other components added for the community, which was great.
Right, and the narrator brunch as well, to bring all of the narrators who participated in this project together to get to know one another as well.
And that was great. So at the end of the oral histories, once they were all recorded, we brought folks together and they talked about their experience with the project and shared some of their priorities for the watershed. And they highlighted 3 that I thought were really important for other folks to hear. Those were truth-telling, relationships, and land back. Those are the 3 priorities among many things that the narrators highlighted. And what was cool about this project is that there were so many people involved. So you met with 14 people who were interviewed, and they represented at least 9 tribal backgrounds. And so here's just a few of them: Dakota, Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Assiniboine, Lakota, Miwok, Ottawa, Ponca, and Zuni. So lots of different backgrounds, many perspectives, but even among those unique perspectives, I think there were some common themes in the interviews. And I wondered if you wanted to highlight any of those for people who are about to listen to this podcast and hear these interviews.
Right. So there were themes that emerged. Crystal and I collaborated on constructing a set of questions that we used to guide the interviews. So I think that is part of these themes that emerged, but each interview really took its own natural direction as well. I would say the conversations all flowed really smoothly. So what I did notice during these conversations was that all of the narrators had something to say about education, whether it was their personal experience with the education system, the K-12 education system, or even the college level, or the experience of their children or even their grandchildren. So I think that was a really common theme throughout each of the 14 interviews. So when I say education, again, thinking about K-12, but also the college level, and also the participation of the narrator, the narrator's children, or the narrator's grandchildren, their participation and involvement in an Indian education program. So not all 14 narrators had an experience with a designated American Indian education program through the school district, but I would say at least half of them did. Some of the participants and their family members did not attend a public school. Some attended a private school, and some were even further west. I'm thinking about Sam Major in particular, who attended Minnetonka, and she was not aware of and did not participate in an Indian education program during the time that she was a K-12 student. But everybody really talked about how education was so significant to their identity as a Native person in a suburb, for the positive aspects of it, but also kind of the negative aspects of what being a Native person in a suburban school district looks like. So education was a big one. Most of the conversations also took shape around housing and what drew families to the suburbs. Almost everyone shared an experience with housing and an opportunity to have improved housing or home ownership when they moved to a suburban location. So that was true for almost all of the participants. Most of them were homeowners at some point. Several of them were renters, but again, the rental units that were available to them were more affordable and also in better condition as well. So those were the 2 big ones that stuck out to me. This project, as you mentioned, Crystal, at the beginning, really grew out of Valley Community Presbyterian Church's land acknowledgement statement and task force and what that process looks like. So we were also really intentional in the questions and talked to each of the narrators about land acknowledgements. And I thought that conversation also was pretty central to each of the 14 interviews. And everybody had, really strong opinions, but I think everybody who participated was very genuine in their response and recognizing the good work of VCPC and of this project, and wanting to kind of uplift land acknowledgement statements in general so they don't just become those words on a paper or words that we say before events. So everybody was really, again, genuine in how do we build out from a land acknowledgement statement? What can we keep doing? So I thought that was a really great way to kind of wrap up each of the interviews, because that question did come last. And I know Crystal and the Land Acknowledgement Task Force and myself have really taken those words and suggestions to heart. And that's why we're still here 2 years later.
Absolutely. And folks did have such great responses to the question, what do you think about land acknowledgements? That was really eye-opening and helpful for me to hear. So if folks who are listening to the interviews are writing a land acknowledgement or thinking about having one at their organization, I think those answers will be really helpful for them. And that leads into my next question. Kasey, you're so good. So as far as we know, this project is the first gathering of suburban American Indian oral histories in the United States or Canada. And why do you think this work is important? And what follow-up actions do you hope it could inspire in others?
I think it's important on so many levels. I grew up in the Twin Cities, mostly in the 90s, and I attended the largest school district in the state, and I participated in the Indian education program. And I also worked in that Indian education program after I completed college. And though it was the largest school district in the state, with about 500 Native students spread across K through 12, I think it was very common for Native students to feel isolated in many ways, isolated in terms of not physically seeing other American Indian people, but also some isolation in that you're living in a predominantly white suburb, and you're also living away from a reservation community or a really visible urban Indian community like we see in Minneapolis. So I think this project really opens the door to giving a spotlight to the significant American Indian population. We know that about 70% of American Indian people actually live away from reservations, and increasingly in metropolitan areas. So that would be urban cores and then the suburban areas that surround those urban cores. So this is a growing population, and I think it better reflects American Indian people. Right? We don't just live in reservations. We don't just live in urban areas, but there's a whole subgroup that lives in growing suburban environments. So I think that's part of why this project is so important. And I think the other part of why this project is so important is that these suburban geographies are Indigenous places. Of course, in Minneapolis or in Minnesota, I think this is a little bit more visible than in other places. But when we have places like Minnetonka and Wayzata and Shakopee and Anoka, I think it's a little bit easier sometimes to be like, oh yes, look at the name of our suburb. That is an Indigenous name, but then we lose sight of the actual Native people who live there contemporarily and the Native people who have always lived there. And this project, again, sheds light on that Indigenous history of, hey, we're focusing on the Bassett Creek watershed for this project, and that is a Dakota place. So what does it mean for this suburb to be a Dakota place? What does it mean to live in a Dakota place as a Dakota person or an Ojibwe person or as a Miwok person? So I think this project really lifts up these really two important dynamics, being a suburban Indian and then suburbs as historically Indian places. And again, this is something no other project, oral history project, has done in the United States or Canada.
That's really remarkable. That is so remarkable. And I love that you're highlighting the importance of Indigenous place names that came through from the narrators when we had our brunch. One of their important priorities was truth-telling, and using Indigenous place names was a way to do that. Well, Kasey, you did such a fantastic job running this project and meeting with folks, listening to their stories and encouraging them to share what they would like to see happen around them. So truly thank you for all of the good work that you've done.
Well, thank you, Crystal. I think this is very much a team effort. And you have kept us on track along the way and have just been a true pleasure to work with. And actually, everybody at Valley Community Presbyterian Church has been so welcoming, not only to me and my family, but also all the narrators and Native community members as well. I think part of this process, in asking about land acknowledgements in particular, you also have to be open to the critiques and to the negative and to the things that are a little bit more difficult to hear and then enact. And I think you all have done it so gracefully and really taken this as an opportunity to learn. And really, it is a model of how to do not only land acknowledgements, but also oral histories.
Thank you. You're so kind, Kasey. Thank you. Well, we're happy to share what we've learned. If anyone out there would like to learn more, feel free to reach out to the church, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, or the Hennepin History Museum. That's where all the transcripts and the recordings are preserved. So if you have questions, we'd love to chat. But again, thank you, Kasey. Thank you so much for all your good work.
Well, you are welcome, Krista. I'm excited to see where this project continues to go.
Thank you.
Ҷayə Wakpadaŋ Wakpadaŋ. Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Ҷayə Wakpadaŋ Wakpadaŋ. Thank you for listening.